Welcome back. There is one challenge that every government in the world, democratic or autocratic, is facing, and that is climate change. It requires urgent action. It requires multilateral action. And one question is whether democracies can produce results on the fast timeline that is required. To discuss this, let me introduce our panel. We have with us Stephanie Epner. She is a senior advisor on climate change and foreign policy at the State Department. Rachel Kyte, she is dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and David Orr, professor of practice at Arizona State University and a distinguished professor emeritus at Oberlin College. Thank you all for being with me here today. Rachel Kyte, I'd like to start with you if I could. President Biden, as a candidate, promised aggressive action on climate change, and he has chalked up some wins. However, his Build Back Better plan, which include massive amounts of funding for climate change initiatives, was defeated in the Senate. Is this an illustration of how hamstrung democracies can be in trying to address this very urgent crisis?
Well, it's an illustration of the fact that climate change is everything and everything is impacted by climate change. And that's not been the discussion that we've been having. That's not been the public engagement for a while. So it's very difficult to bring comprehensive legislation onto the ground and expect to sort of just be able to move it through quickly. And also you can't take it out of the context of what's going on in just the political substructure and the amount of vested interest and middlemen and money that does very well out of the old fossil fuel powered economy that hasn't yet given up its grip on power. So I think we've seen in the United States, but we can see around the world, Australia and other countries, that we're talking about transitions. Climate action requires a transition through the energy system. It requires a food system transition, a financial system transition, which means going into a very different way of imagining and regulating our economy across all sectors. That isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to be one step or two steps forward and one step back. And it means also a very different bottom-up conversation as people understand their own resilience and their need to be able to be resilient in the face of climate impacts, and then a top-down conversation based on the science, explaining what the options are and why we're going to do things today which will reap benefits in 5 or 10 years' time, but we might not see the benefit tomorrow. That's a very different kind of public conversation where you can leave no one behind. Democracies on paper should be able to do that well, but our democracies are weak for other reasons, and climate change is showing how difficult that is.
Stephanie, let me ask you to respond as our representative of the administration here. Do you think the administration did a good enough job explaining how critical the linkage was between this legislation and the climate change situation?
I think, from day one, the president, and frankly, before day one, on the campaign trail as well, the president has been crystal clear about the priority level he views climate change with. And that's been true at the State Department. It's been true at the White House. It's been true at the EPA. It's been true in every agency, frankly, in his administration. I think people have gotten their marching orders that this is a top priority. In our engagement with the public and the Hill, the work continues. I think certainly connecting the dots, as Rachel indicated, is a huge part of this. It's not just about even energy, or it's not just about the tropes that have been floating around, the criticisms about hamburgers and that sort of thing. It's really about everything. Climate change is going to fundamentally change the way that we live. It's going to change our security landscape. It's going to change any number of things. And that's why it's so important. But what we've also tried to focus on are the enormous opportunities for America, the enormous potential for leadership in a variety of sectors that are going to be fundamental to transforming not just the United States, but the world over the course of the coming decades, because we know the writing is on the wall. That transformation will need to happen. I think the Hill conversation also continues, and we know that there are multiple paths to reaching the ambitious goals that the president has set out, including the national determined contribution, the international target he set of reducing our emissions by 50 to 52% below the 2005 levels come 2030. We're taking a number of actions right now. The infrastructure law, the bipartisan infrastructure law, will help us get well on our way. And we're taking a number of executive actions as well. We're working with our Senate colleagues, I know, with Senator Manchin and everyone else on the Hill to help them find ways to make progress, because we really need to be pushing on this from every direction. And I don't think for 1 second we're letting up on our commitment to the goals that we set from day one of this administration.
David, Rachel mentioned that money played a part in this. Talk to me for a moment, if you would, about the fate of Build Back Better and whether you think it demonstrates the role that corporate money is playing in the ability of this democracy in particular to make progress.
Well, I think it is. And I think to follow Stephanie, I would say that the administration has done something that really is quite notable and quite good. It's tried to see the climate issue as a systemic issue and join different agencies of government together in a unified purpose. The difficulty with Build Back Better is obvious. The short-term interests, and particularly of a few states and a few senators, has blocked this, but that's nothing new. Money in politics, as we've known for a long time, has corrupted our ability to reckon with these kind of long-term issues. I think in stepping back too, any response to climate change has to be done in the recognition that this is what's been called a long emergency. It's not going to end quickly. It won't end until we've restored the heat balance of the planet, and that's a long time off. But the steps from here to there are obvious in the beginning, and I think the administration's done an exceptionally good job at laying that out. Bringing the American public along in the middle of an insurrection is a tricky thing, though, as we're seeing.
Rachel, democracy is messy, and it operates on a cycle, which is 4 years long, sometimes 2 years long, with midterms coming up. Does that make it difficult for a democracy, whether it's the United States or another around the world, to deal with a long-term problem like climate change, because you have shifting personalities and policies?
I'm not sure that it makes that it's an issue of democracy. The short-termism is in politics, electoral politics. The short-termism is in the financial system as well. And the two coming together have given us what has been described as a tragedy of the horizon, which is that the decision-making is just taking account of today, quarterly returns, electoral results 2 or 4 years out. So the ability to be able to ratchet progress over a longer time frame is one that you see different countries and different governments, or all democracies, wrestling with. And you see countries enshrining in legislation long-term targets, and then creating statutory bodies that guide government towards that target. You see in most countries an ability to get over a sort of a partisan discussion of the what, and they're now having partisan fights about the how. I think we're still stuck in the United States having a discussion about the what because of the quite extraordinary amount of money in politics, which is different, I think, than other democracies around the world. So the question of the how is where it becomes really important. And this is actually where democracies should be an advantage, because the how is about everybody imagining how their life is going to be better as we tackle these extraordinary problems. And so at the city level, we have to have, as we've learned through the pandemic, policies that allow us to take care of each other in order to be able to take care of ourselves. So a city is not going to thrive if large parts of the cities where low-income populations live are uninhabitable because of extreme heat. So I think that we have to put democracy in action at the local level. And then what the federal government has to do is find a way to put long-term targets in place so that they can't get battered about, on each electoral cycle, or in this country, between different parties that haven't yet agreed that this is an emergency.
David, you've written that we need to reinvent or reimagine democracy to cope more effectively with climate change. Explain what you're talking about.
And we've got a couple hours to discuss that.
We don't. We only have a couple of minutes.
If I can step back a minute, COVID was like a stress test for us, and it exposed a lot of the things that we're going to see that we have to reckon with in terms of climate change as the planet warms. So if democracy 1.0 was Greek democracy, and maybe call a democracy of Jefferson and Madison 2.0, and in between. So this is 3.0. And if you were to ask the question, can democracy deal with climate change as it's conceived now, the answer, I think, has to be no. I think we have to deal with money in politics. We have to learn how to calibrate the way we govern and do the public business with how Earth works as a physical system. That's a long-term challenge. That's both democracy and then the elected governance system. So how do we reckon with this over the longer term? And that's we're going to have to reinvent a democracy. I think it's going to start with a lot of civic education. That's why educational institutions need to be important players here. And then a lot of deep thinking about how we begin to adjust how we do the public business in a democratic way. And I think Stephanie and Rachel are exactly right that we have an advantage as democracy because this is all hands on deck time. And we need the ingenuity of 335 million Americans apply to this, whether it's kids in their local schools or farmers out in Kansas or people developing solar utilities in various cities. But I think we have an advantage there. And then the other advantage, I think, is the free flow of information. That's why a free press is so critically important to engage the public and find solutions. But this is going to be a test of ingenuity.
Are existing multilateral institutions up for dealing with this job? Or Stephanie, do we need new configurations and new collaborations to make significant progress?
I think the answer is both and. One way that the Biden administration has been putting climate at the center of our foreign policy has been by elevating the role that it plays in any number of multilateral fora. So not only the UNFCCC, though, of course, we rejoined the Paris Agreement and are now heavily engaged on that global effort as well. But we also have engaged heavily in bringing climate to the forefront of discussions at NATO, at the UN Security Council, in the G7, even in the G20. These conversations everywhere policy is being discussed, whether it's a global policy, whether it's security policy or economic policy or anything in between, trade policy, maritime policy, climate has a role to play in all of these fora. And it is something that's well understood. We're certainly driving a lot of it, but our international partners, in most cases, very much understand why the fora need to be adapted to look through their challenges through a climate lens. But absolutely, you could see additional institutions being developed to address this challenge as different aspects of it come to the forefront, and we realize that some of our existing tools aren't working. And some of the new arrangements or revived arrangements that the Biden administration has engaged in, things like the Quad, which right now Secretary Blinken is out in Australia. This is a group of the US, Australia, Japan, and India. Climate is a central piece of that diplomatic arrangement. We talk about a range of issues as the four countries, but we certainly talk about climate and we talk about energy. So I think it's anywhere we can engage on climate. That's exactly what we're seeking to do.
I really want Rachel to weigh in here. She has deep international experience, particularly in the financial realm. And this is going to take money. So Rachel, give us your thoughts.
Well, so to spice it up a little bit, the answer to your original question is, do we have the Multilateral Institute? No. Absolutely not. No, no, no. And if you were an alien and you came down and landed on Earth and you knew there was a climate emergency, it would be puzzling to you why the Security Council doesn't have this as a real theme of work, and that when they do actually discuss it, one of the P5 can sort of veto any really intelligent outcome from that discussion. It would also be confusing to you why, as democracies, we can work together with Australia, but when we sign trade agreements, as the UK just did with Australia, there's no real mention of climate in there as well. And if this were an emergency and we were allies of democracies, we'd be asking each other in our trade agreement, how can we help Australia meet its net zero target? And how can Australia help the UK meet its net zero target. So we have not yet internalized the climate crisis into our multilateral system. The UN is struggling. The World Bank and the IMF were created for a crisis in the 1940s, and they have not internalized how their articles could work for this crisis. And I think that this is actually a redesign moment. It's a reset moment. And I think COVID, to go back to the point that David made, COVID has ripped the Band-Aid off how brittle the international system is and how we need something else. The final point is that there is no solution to any of these problems without an engaged private sector. Again, something that should give democracies an advantage. And most of our multilateral system doesn't know how to work well with the private sector.
I want to work in a couple of audience questions here. The first one comes from Cortland. He's in Denver and writes, how do democracies address climate change given the rampant divisions and partisanship in many countries? David, do you want to tackle that?
Is there an easier question in the queue there?
No, none of them are easy.
Well, we've got to work through a tough period in American history. This is people are now talking seriously about a civil war and conflict, whatever that might mean and whatever you think about that, but it's a tough period. And I think restoring civility is essential to democracy. The word civility and civic and citizen all are linked for good reason. And I think we have to learn how to talk to each other again. That's not going to be a quick fix. One of the things I hang my hat in an educational institution, as does Rachel, and I think that we have to educate a generation that can talk to each other across their differences. And climate change isn't a liberal or conservative issue. It's forward or backward. And the rules of the game of democracy, I think, have to be underscored here. If you imagine a football game without rules and referees, and teams show up with hand grenades and Uzis, that's not football, that's war. And that's where we've come to in American political discourse. So this is an appeal to the angels of our better nature to rise above this discord. I think it would help a great deal to be able to control the venom that drips into the body politic. I don't think you can have that much lies and information dripping into the bloodstream of the political system and run a democracy. Now that raises other big issues, the First Amendment and freedoms and so forth. I'll leave that to other people. But I think there's a real challenge to rebuild a civic awareness and devotion to that civic structure that is the United States and the global community.
We have a linked question, and Rachel, I'm going to put this in your direction. Matthew, a Corbell student, asks, why have civil society efforts surrounding climate change failed to develop into comprehensive climate policy in the US?
Well, I think there's extraordinary new sort of momentum over the last few years, in particular from young people, from middle schoolers all the way up. I think that that's the pressure that representatives locally, state, and then federal are going to have to respond to. And I think that is shaping. I mean, I think that the commitment, President Biden ran on a climate ticket, and I think that's a response to that kind of movement. Now we need to see it move forward in terms of bills that pass Congress. I think there's something very different that these young people are saying. What I hear them saying to government is, tell us the truth. Tell people the truth, and then the people can be mobilized. I think that's extraordinarily important. And when we look around the world and we see leaders of democracies that are doing well in managing the pandemic, but also managing the climate conversation, they are using some kind of reciprocal vulnerability. They're saying, this is going to be an extraordinary task that will take everyone. We don't have every answer right now, but together we will be able to figure it out over the course of the next 20 years. And that engages people and allows for more social trust, as David was saying. We don't have a lot of that reciprocal vulnerability in the way we lead in this country at the federal level at the moment.
Rachel, Stephanie, climate change is going to have profound impacts. We're potentially going to have food shortages, water shortages, conflict, migration, economic decline. Are those forces going to undermine democracies around the world?
Look, I think it's something that we are endeavoring to plan for and prepare for now to reduce the risk of those things. We know that climate change is a security risk. I agree with Rachel. It should be front and center in the UN Security Council discussions and any related conversations because of all of the reasons that you mentioned. It makes really tough situations even worse. The most vulnerable countries in the world, the most fragile states in the world are also the most climate vulnerable countries in many cases. So I think that there's a lot of effort to get our arms around that, to expand capacity in the intelligence community and to be partnering more with scientists to be better prepared for what we know is coming, not just in the United States, but around the world, and to help those that are really going to be hit hardest prepare for the worst. But I also think, we talk about building resilience quite a bit in climate circles and being ready. And part of building resilience is strengthening democracies. It's strengthening, support for good governance, for fighting corruption. These are the kinds of things that are essential to foster that element of trust, what Rachel was just describing. That's essential in the US. We have a lot of work to do, certainly here. But overseas, climate action is not just about, changing over to renewable energy, although those things are important. It's also making sure that as resources become increasingly scarce, that the governments are able to meet the needs of their citizens, and that in places where migration is necessary, that the populations that are forced to move aren't facing humanitarian crisis and not only having their shelter and food taken away, but also their democratic rights. We want to build resilience to those elements as well.
Rachel, do you think that autocrats might use some of these negative results of climate change to actually strengthen their grip?
I don't know whether they strengthen their grip. I think they're making. They've been able to make some sort of serious allegations against whether democracies are fit for purpose, and we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, and we saw most recently in November at the climate talks that the Chinese were very eager to talk to Western press outlets, but also to talk to other countries about the fact that they had a plan for ambition and a plan for implementation, and that the United States had a plan for ambition and no plan for implementation. And so I do think they do like to point out that they can get things done. And of course, diplomatically, they have a long tradition of under-promising and over-delivering. And you could argue that in some countries within Europe and the United States have struggled with the over-delivering. So I think that that's the issue. But there's a very important part of climate action, which is the fact that this has to work for everybody. You can't get to a climate sort of action success if the 1% or if the elites are taken care of. And one of the weaknesses of our current democracies is that inequality has been rampant for the last 20 years, and that this is really corrosive. So as we come forward, we're going to have to solve for inequality and solve for climate. They can't be delinked. And I think that actually that would put democracies again at an advantage if it understands that that is the task that is ahead of us. Whereas I think for autocrats, that is not normally where they've been able to deliver over a long period of time successfully.
David, we have a question for you. I'm going to ask you to keep your answer short because we're low on time. But the question is, this comes from Marta in Boulder. How might the arts and humanities be strategically aligned and funded to help reach climate change goals based on social science that suggests its values, attitudes, and beliefs must be affected and engaged?
Marta, that is a really good question. I think that if it was data alone and science alone, we would have solved this problem a long time ago. Data hasn't helped us get across the finish line, so to speak. And so the arts and music and the film Don't Look Up recently, they hit us in a very different way. And so that's, it's like salt in the stew. It's small by volume maybe, but it's large by effect. It changes the flavor of what we're trying to do. And we need to find a deeper level of our humanity to be able to act on behalf of not just ourselves, but people in other countries and also future generations. One of the keys here, we cast a long shadow on future generations. and they have to be given standing by some system of proxy in our decisions. And I think the arts and music and poetry and all of those kinds of things that hit us very, very differently are important in this whole movement.
I want to do a quick round robin. Stephanie, you alluded to this earlier, that we need to strengthen our democracies to make them more resilient. If we were going to do that, the top thing that should happen. Stephanie, let me start with you there. Oh, you're muted. Can you unmute for us?
Very sorry. I was saying expand the role of civil society. I think the more voices we have in this conversation, the better we'll be at meeting the needs of everyone.
Right. David, your thoughts? What's the one thing we could do to be more resilient?
Well, I think Rachel hit on it. It's equality. And inequality worsens everything that we want to do in democratic society and all the social variables. So inequality, to me, is the most important thing to work on.
Rachel, your thought?
Yeah, we should be extending the franchise, not restricting it. This will fall differently in different parts of the population. And why not extend it to 16-year-olds? They have the biggest stake here.
Rachel, Kyte, David Orr, and Stephanie Epner, thank you all for joining us today. More on climate change coming up, so stay with us.